If you have any questions, feel free to ask and I'll do my best to answer them for you. So we're now standing on the deck of the Dunbrody, which is a replica of the original ship, which was built in 1845 in Quebec in Canada. Now it was built in Canada for the simple reason that the type of timber required for the construction of such a ship couldn't be sourced in Ireland at the time. The ship was, however, commissioned by a New Ross family, the Graves family, who were ship merchants, and it was one of a fleet of 8 ships commissioned by them at the time. Now, it was primarily built as a cargo vessel. However, with the onset of the famine, a lot of cargo vessels were outfitted to carry passengers. Now, the Dunbrody would usually sail from New Ross to New York or Quebec, carrying on average 176 passengers, and would return with cargo such as timber and guano. Now, guano was birds' droppings and it was used at the time as a fertilizer. However, in the peak of the famine in 1847, there are records that the Dunbrody carried 313 passengers on one sailing. So that was almost double the ship's capacity. Now, out of the 313 passengers, 8 people died. 5 people died on board the ship and a further 3 died in quarantine. Now, this was said to be quite a low mortality rate for a ship of that era, as a lot of the ships of the time would have been termed coffin ships, for the simple reason that it wasn't unheard of to hear of 50% of a ship's passengers dying on a sailing. Now, the low mortality rate of the Dunbrody is said to be put down to the ship's captain. He was a Welshman, Captain John Williams, and he was said to be very dedicated and humane towards his crew and towards his passengers. Now, they say that he had training in the medical profession and that he tended to the sick on board the ship. Now, in a few moments, we're going to go down below deck to take a look at the living conditions of the passengers. But before we do so, I'm just going to point out a few features on the deck of the ship. So if you just look down to the stern of the ship, you can see the ship's wheel. Now, the wheel is connected to a long piece of timber that runs way down into the water. It's known as a rudder, and that basically steers the ship. Now, you can see this wooden-like structure just in front of us here as well, folks. We're going to go down that in just a few moments. It's known as the ship's companionway, and it's a stairway that will take us from the deck of the ship down to the steerage area of the ship. Okay, folks, before we go down below deck, I'm just going to move you up here to the bow, so we'll continue up here.
Dad, can you take some pictures as well?
Sure.
From New Ross to New York was generally between 6 to 8 weeks, and that depended on the weather conditions. Okay, now this cabin-like structure just in front of me here, that's known as the galley. Now, the galley is where the ship's cook prepared food for the first class passengers and for the crew. Now, they would have dined on dried meat such as salted beef or salted pork, or on occasion they would have had fresh meat, as there was live animals kept on board the ship also. And the animals were kept in under here in an area that was known as the forecastle deck. So it was mainly pigs, chickens and sheep that they stored in there. So the animals were slaughtered and given to the first class passengers and to the crew as meat. Now, the poor steerage passengers, they would have to fend for themselves. Now, their food rations consisted of 3.5 pounds of flour, oatmeal or rice, which was distributed to them on a weekly basis, and 6 pints of water, which they got each day. Now, there would have been 2 fires lit up here on the deck of the ship, and the steerage passengers would have to queue up to cook their foods up here. However, if there was rough weather conditions, the fires wouldn't have been lit, so on occasion the steerage passengers would have to eat their foods raw. So it was basically like raw porridge, just oatmeal and water when they didn't get to cook at the fires. Now the Dunbrody is known as a 3-masted bark, and the mast furthest away from us is known as the mizzen mast. The mast in the centre is the main mast of the ship, and it measures 110 feet from the deck right up to the very top. So the crew on board the ship did have a very tough job. They'd have to climb up the rigging and out along the yards to untie the sails. So it wouldn't have been a pleasant job out in the middle of the Atlantic in rough weather conditions. And the mast just here in front of us is the foremast. Now the original masts of the ship wouldn't have been steel, and they would have been made from a timber known as Douglas fir. Now if you look out to the very tip of the ship, you'll see 2 long pieces of timber, and they're what's known as the bowsprit. From the tip of the bowsprit right down to the very end of the ship, that measures 176 feet in length, and the width of the ship is 28 feet, so it's the same dimensions as the original. And just here beside me is the ship's bell. Now the bell is the only original feature of the ship, so it's over 150 years old. Now the original Dunbrody was shipwrecked off the coast of Labrador in 1875 while operating again as a cargo ship, and the only thing they salvaged was the bell. So this was donated by the ancestors of the Graves family when this replica was being built. So you can give it a ring at the end of the tour, guys, okay? I'm going to take you below deck next for a look at the living conditions.